Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to do the real minimum requirement to play Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The proposed minimum requirement was a i5 8400 or Ryzen 5 2600, 16GB of RAM, a GTX 1060 6GB or a RX 580, probably the 8GB variant. We're going to test that at 1080p, lowest settings, to reach a target of 30 FPS, and if we need, using FSR or any upscaling available. Welcome to Response PC. I'm Dunk, let's game on. Starting off with the i3 6100, yes, a 2-gen lower with i3 instead of i5. This is a 2-core 4-thread CPU clock at 3.7, 16GB of RAM, and the GTX at 960 4GB. Obviously playing at 1080p, the lowest setting possible, and we have FSR balance enabled. That gives us an average FPS of 55, so it's highly playable. I mean, we can go down on everything, being at 60 FPS in the wild and drop down to 52 FPS in the city, in small city. So when you reach a castle or bigger city, expect a bigger drop in FPS. Also keep in mind that when I reached that small beginner city, the CPU was at 98% of utilization. So this 2-core 4-thread CPU is already at the limit, or maybe it's the number of core that is limiting the FPS. Next up, I want to test higher clock, so I went with my i3 7350K, which is a 4.2 GHz clock speed, still a 2-core 4-thread, to see if the clock speed will help instead of a core/thread number, and kept the rest of the hardware the same. So the GTX 960 4GB and 16GB of RAM. It helped to some extent, because now we have a CPU usage in the high 80s. Still not optimal, but a bit more playable, I guess. GPU utilization, VRAM utilization, and RAM utilization all stay the same from the i3 6100. Oh, also our FPS stay exactly the same. Then I went to lower generation to test the core/thread. So this is the i7 4771. This is 4-core 8-thread, but boosting at 3.9, so lower gigahertz than the i3 7350. And even if the CPU is pegged at 3.9 gigahertz, is a 4-core 8-thread is helping a lot. We barely using 50% of the power of the CPU. So definitely the number of core/thread is more important than the clock speed. And for this test, I went with the GTX 1050. This is a 2GB card. It's not the TI with a 4GB. Just want to see how the game handle less VRAM than what it is proposed. And I can tell you it can be done at the lowest settings, 1080p still, not even 720, but you have to put the FSR on performance to have at least 39 FPS average. And if you want to put FSR on balance, I get an average of 30 FPS. You borderline going under the 30 FPS here and there when you are in the city, or in this case, the small village. I also went to try the GTX 780, which is a 3GB card, but as you can see, the card does not support the X12 and it won't launch. We get error message and the game just closed. So the lowest you can go will be the GTX 900 series and the GTX 750 Ti if you have the 4GB variant. I don't think the 2GB will do it. So next up, I have the i7 920. Yes, a first-gen i7 with the GTX 1050, because we were almost able to reach a stable 30 FPS with FSR. And since this game like core/thread versus the gigahertz of the CPU, but the GTX 1050 is a little bit too low. We're now at 26 FPS at FSR performance, so it also look ugly. So let's up a little bit the GPU with the GTX 1050 Ti. So now we have 4GB of VRAM instead of 2, still with the i7 920 at 1080p, lowest settings, and FSR balance. We get an average FPS of 56 in the wild and 42 FPS in the city, a small village, giving us an average of 46 FPS overall. GPU is pegged at 100% using 3.8 out of 4GB of VRAM, and the most interesting part is the i7 920. This old 4-core 8-thread CPU still holds itself, using from 70 to mid 80% of utilization. So I guess this will be our winner for the CPU side on Intel side, and for the GPU on Nvidia side should be the GTX 960. Switching now to AMD side on the CPU and the GPU, starting off with the Ryzen 5 1600. So we drop an entire gen from the Ryzen 5 2600, and from the RX 580 drop to the RX 570 4GB variant. I know both that CPU and GPU will be able to do the job. I just want to test to see what will be the extent of that set job. And at 1080p, lowest settings and FSR balance, we get an average of 50 FPS. We've reached 65 FPS in the wild, and we drop as low as 41 FPS in the city in combat. That's quite a gap between the open world and in city, but what can we do? The GPU is pegged at 99%, using is 4GB of VRAM. The CPU obviously have a lot of headroom, using only 30 to 40% of its utilization. So let's drop those hardware to even lower, and that will be the Ryzen 3 1200, so the lowest Ryzen you can get, with the RX 560 4GB variant. The CPU is a 4-core 4-thread, but it seems to hold itself better than the 2-core 4-thread from Intel side, as the CPU utilization went in the mid-50s the whole time. No bottleneck coming from the CPU. For the RX 560 4GB variant was holding quite well. At 1080p lowest setting and FSR balance, we get an average of 36 FPS, having 43 FPS in the open world and 32 in the city in combat. In the city you were close to 35 FPS, but when engaging you drop it to the low 30s. I'm not sure if we can go lower in CPU and GPU for AMD side, but let's try. And now a quick test, the R9 380 4GB variant, just to compare to the RX 560. The card is actually more powerful than the RX 560, but is it supported? It is, and it gives even better performance. We have an average of 50 FPS, having 44 in the city, village, and 55 to 57 in the wild. The requirement for this game seems to be 4GB of VRAM and DX12. Anyway, that was just a quick test with the GPU, but it clearly can do the job even better than the RX 560, even if it's older. And finally, the lowest CPU I will go for this testing will be the FX 6300 with the RX 560 4GB variant, and that was a disaster. MSI Afterburner don't report properly the CPU usage, but we are CPU bottleneck. The RX 560 4GB variant cannot even keep up at 30 FPS. This is with FSR performance, not even balance. We actually have a hard time to hit the mid-20s. We get an average of 23 FPS, and it's quite choppy on top of that. So what's our winner? On Intel side will be the i7 920. On AMD will be the Ryzen 3 1200. For the GPU on Nvidia we'll have the GTX 960 or GTX 1050 Ti, which give similar results. And on AMD will be the RX 560 4GB variant. You can comment below your PC spec if you want me to test your hardware for this game, if you want to buy it. If I have it, I will test it. Thanks for watching, see you on the next one, and subscribe.